Hello again. So this time we're going to talk about two additional identifying markers that were in the introductory video for this week, sex and gender. So just like the previous video that you've watched that talked about race and ethnicity, sex and gender are two words, two concepts that I hear regularly or even see on application forms and questionnaires. Regularly they're used interchangeably, but you cannot use them interchangeably. They don't mean the same thing, so you can't use them one word in place of the next. So we're going to, in this short video, we're going to learn the difference in them so we won't make those mistakes that other uneducated people make when they use them interchangeably. And also, we're going to take this information from this video into future videos to understand some power structures, the race and ethnicity, and then also this sex and gender discussion. That video and this one, we're going to take it into some of the future lessons that we have this week when we look at power structures and even like the designs of cities and how we can look at patterns of succession. We'll talk about that in a future video, and how neighborhoods can transition from one category of people to the next and be identified as a territory for a particular ethnic group or even sexuality category, these kinds of things. Okay, so let's talk about just the basic difference between sex and gender here. So sex is a biological category because there are internal and external, we call them primary and secondary sex characteristics that organisms have. And I'm using the word organism here. Of course, in cultural geography class, we're going to talk about people, but I want to be more general here when I'm talking about sex because organisms in general have sex classifications based on biological characteristics. So if you think back to like 7th grade biology, maybe it was biology class, or even in your current biology class, there's probably a page in the textbook that shows you a lily flower and how the lily flower, maybe a cross section of a lily flower. So you see the ovary in the lily, and you also see the stamen and the pollen and all of these different things. And a lily flower I am using as an example because it is an organism, and those words that I just rattled off are physical sex categories or sex characteristics. They are biological components of that organism that enable reproduction to happen. So in sex, we can look at the plant world, like the example I just used, or anything in the animal kingdom. Human beings, we are in the animal kingdom. So we can look at any organism in the animal kingdom or any of the plants in the plant kingdom, and we can observe whether they do or don't have sex characteristics. So listen to me when I say this to you, please, because not only do people use the word sex and gender interchangeably, and they can't be used interchangeably, but also there's another problem with some of the ways uneducated people use the word sex. There happen to be 3 naturally occurring sex categories in nature. Now, there were some redundancies in that sentence because I want to focus on the word nature, naturally, not abnormal, but natural. So in the plant and animal kingdom, there are 3 naturally occurring sex categories. Male is a sex category based on the physical and biological characteristics that are classified as fully male. Female is a sex category based on the physical characteristics and biological characteristics that are classified as female, but there is a third naturally occurring, not abnormal sex category in plants and animals, and we call that intersex because it does not have simply male characteristics only or simply female characteristics only, and rarely a complete set of both, but a mixture of some male and some female characteristics in the same organism, like the lily flower has both male and female characteristics in the same organism. The state tree of Arkansas is a holly tree, and it is, there are some female trees and there are some male trees. So some plants have male and female. Some are intersex, just like in the animal kingdom. So in human beings, which is what we're talking about here, very complex animals we have some people who are fully male and born that way, some people who are fully female and born that way, but we have a statistically significant number of people who are born in the intersex category. That is, sometimes physicians cannot say, is this a male or a female, just by looking at external genitalia. Sometimes it's not possible to say, is this male or female, because not everybody has a cookie cutter appearance in the genitalia department. And so sometimes it's not possible for a baby to be identified, but also internally, sometimes we don't necessarily have the components that should or shouldn't be expected to be there. So for instance, when a male baby is born, his testes have not dropped yet into his scrotum. That happens at a little bit later time. But for some babies, after, when that's supposed to be happening, we find out, well, the testes aren't there. Or sometimes in the female genitalia, there are larger parts than you would normally expect, and sometimes it might appear to be a scrotum when it's not. So these types of differences in those physical characteristics that are classified as male or female are grouped into one category called intersex, and it's a naturally occurring category, not anything to be considered abnormal, but in our particular society in the United States, we aren't very familiar with this category. So I wanted to make sure that we covered it briefly together just now. Okay? So sex is about biology. Gender is about the culture's definitions of how you should behave based on your degree of masculinity or your degree of femininity or anything in between. So gender is a spectrum. It's a spectrum of behaviors, okay? So yes, gender is linked to sex, because maleness, which is a sex category, is linked directly in our culture's habits, customs, traditions, expectations, in our norms. Male is linked to masculinity. Female is linked to femininity. And intersex is linked to whatever social identity, gender identity, the individual determines for him or herself, if those are the proper pronouns, later in life. However, how many times do parents impose gender categories onto newborn? It doesn't even have to be a newborn. I started to say newborn, but before babies are even born, there are a lot of gender reveal parties, and there's a lot of pink balloons or blue balloons or any of these kinds of assumptions about baby's personality, baby's gender identity. So gender is a big deal in our society. Gender is a big deal in all societies, no matter how complex, like the United States, or how simplistic, meaning maybe, a country that's or a culture that is homogenous, that has no variation really, just one cultural pattern rather than a lot of ethnic groups mixed in, a lot of diversity like we have in the United States. But gender is a spectrum of behaviors. And as an example, I'll use a term that was applied to me a lot growing up. I was referred to as a tomboy. Well, I am female. As far as I know, I'm fully female, and my parents made no decision to, look at my air quotes, correct any kind of mix of sexuality when I was born or in my early youth. So I'm female. And femininity is typically linked, the assumption of femininity is typically linked with female status. But as a child, I really wanted to be a boy. So a boy is a gender category because there are behaviors associated with boyhood that are not acceptable or associated with girlhood. Now, some behaviors overlap, but I found myself, when I was a child, being a female child, I found myself constantly being corrected. Girls don't sit that way. Sit this way if you're a girl. Walk like a lady. Don't walk like a linebacker, whatever that is. Anyway, so when I was a child, I had interests, behaviors, and hobbies that were more closely aligned to masculinity than femininity, though I was a female, so tomboy was a label applied to me. Tomboy is therefore a gender because it was about my behavioral manifestations, not my sexual manifestations, okay? And here when I say sexual, I'm not talking about sexuality yet. We will talk about sexuality in a future lecture. I'm talking about your biological category of sex. So gender is a spectrum. Tomboy is a gender category, just like girly man is a gender category. Y'all probably don't even know who Arnold Schwarzenegger is, but he was famous for dissing people. He was famous for insulting guys by calling them girly men because he was this big bodybuilder guy. And so he was apparently at his peak, the apex of masculinity. He was male and he epitomized what the far side of the spectrum was for masculinity. And anytime he wanted to diss somebody, he'd call him a girly man. Or one of my favorite movies is Sandlot. And do you remember when they're fighting or they're screaming back and forth at each other and the ultimate insult was you throw like a girl? That was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? I mean, it was a throwdown after that. So masculinity and femininity are about behavioral expectations, and sex is about your biological parts, okay? There is an overlap, there is a connection. Just like in this country, we talked about the connection between racial categories and some ethnic categories in our previous lecture. There is an overlap between sex categories and gender expectations in a society. But gender expectations differ from one society to the next. Sex categories don't. They're the same. They're biologically bound, and we are one species, human beings, and so they are biologically bound. There are 3 naturally occurring sex categories everywhere human beings are found. But gender and the definitions associated with masculinity, the definitions associated with femininity, the spectrum in between, what makes a tomboy or not, or whether tomboy as a phrase is something that's even recognized in that particular culture's habits and traditions, those things, these gender things, are used to describe masculinity and femininity, and gender is a social construction. There is no gene, biologically, a chromosome or some kind of DNA structure that says females are going to like pink sparkly things, or that males are going to be muscle-bound bodybuilders. There is no genetic marker that in biology that mandates or dictates that. These are behavioral expectations defined by a society and therefore applied to expectations that exist for our behavior based on the category of people to which we belong. So these are different markers in our self-identity and in our social identity. Gender fluidity, which is a current event or a current topic, I guess, that we can talk about. There's a lot of training going on in public school systems right now for the teachers to be aware of gender differences and be accepting of gender fluidity and all of this kind of stuff. So these are issues that first world nations like ours can focus on because, again, we don't have issues with absolute poverty that is a life-threatening situation. We don't have issues with terrible, disease coming from the water supply. And when we do have an issue with water supply, like in Flint, Michigan a few years ago, it's like a national scandal, right? Like, how could this have happened? Because we have assumptions about the infrastructure, we have a whole lot of benefits and just advantages based on the fact that we are a first world nation. So these kinds of issues about gender identity and self-identity based on that, rather than social application of gender norms, these are first world issues that we can examine because other societies, gender exists obviously, but it's not necessarily something that people are going to march in the street to protest or to fight for because they don't even have clean water supplies. People are dying before they're 3 months old because there's not, proper resources or infrastructures to support those societies. So some of these issues that you can look up about gender fluidity or any of these other, the connection between sex and gender, or knowledge about intersexuality, these kinds of things, a lot of times you will find first world application of these topics, simply because